Well, in case you hadn't noticed this winter already, the term atmospheric river is getting used a lot. We're doing it just as much as every other media outlet. Take a look at last week from our homepage. Bay Area, atmospheric river to bring heavy rain and winds. It seems like every storm all of a sudden is an atmospheric river. And there's partly some truth to that. Not every storm, but most of them. But there's also some nuance that's required in how we communicate and think about these things. First of all, let's use last year as an example. What you're seeing is a retrospective from last winter. There were 50 atmospheric rivers, technically classifiably atmospheric rivers, 50 of them hit the West Coast last winter. That seems like a lot. Of course, if you look at Central California, and that's how we'll consider the Bay Area, there were 22 that got us. That still seems like a lot. Let's go into some of the explanation for why it seems like we're always hearing about atmospheric rivers now. And let's talk about the ones that matter most. And I've got a perfect example for storms that are not atmospheric rivers, because we get those too. And this week is an excellent example of that, because there's one of them right here. That's the one that brought a lot of rain to Southern California over the last couple of days or so. And then you got an actual storm up here that is an atmospheric river. Let me show you why there's a distinction here. This storm down here, cutoff low, does not have an atmospheric river component to it, at least at this point, and it's just sitting there spinning its wheels, dropping rain. That does, and that's the storm going into the Pacific Northwest over the next couple of days. Look at it another way. Accumulated rainfall shows you how these storms are very different. There's a garden variety cutoff low. You just kind of get rain scattered. When you look at it in the aftermath, you've got a really cool kind of spiral-like depiction to it. That's an atmospheric river. And unfortunately, the imagery on here, because it's high resolution, doesn't go far enough out into the Pacific. Look up here. Now you can really see what these storms look like in terms of the footprint that they leave for rain. And this gives us one vital clue to why it is important to recognize when a storm does have an atmospheric river in it, because it changes the character and the nature of the whole storm. That is a long fetch of moisture stretched out across the entire Pacific. And it's got a lot more rain to work with. You can see what it did when it hit the Pacific Northwest and hits those mountains. It certainly gets a lot more impressive. That same atmospheric river shows up here on the water vapor imagery. And that one is not terribly strong, actually. We need to classify these in terms of their strength and their intensity. And we've actually started doing that over the last few years. So let's go to the next image. And what I want to do is bring up the forecast plot for that atmospheric river that's happening right now, just as an example to better acquaint us with how we measure and categorize these things. First of all, here's a map. And the bigger dot on there shows you there's a bullseye, as we just saw. This current weak atmospheric river is hitting the Pacific Northwest. Here's the forecast through time for it. And as we get into tomorrow, really tonight into tomorrow, as we saw, that thing's making landfall tonight and tomorrow up there. It's got this big blue bar here because it is ranked as a category 2 out of 5. That's not that big a deal, actually. Technically, yes, we saw it. It has features and characteristics very much like an atmospheric river. It was a long plume of atmospheric moisture stretched out back to the subtropics in a narrow band that was pointed right at the Pacific Northwest. Technically a classifiable atmospheric river, but it is a fairly weak one. Remember, we had 50 of these hit the entire West Coast last winter. So are we going to make a big deal out of every single one when there is a scale that goes from 1 to 5? And if you get a category 1 or a 2, they're really not that impactful. In fact, they can be more beneficial than anything else because they can bring rain to parts of the West that need some rain. Now, when you get into category 3s, those can kind of be hazardous, but only if they're falling on a landscape that's already had plenty of storms throughout the winter and it's already saturated. If you've already got very saturated ground, now a category 3 atmospheric river can be problematic. That's not the condition we're necessarily in at this point in the winter. Category 4s and 5s are generally the main ones we want to be aware of. And we don't get that many of those. Those are the ones we really want to sound the alarm on before they get here, because category 4s and category 5s on their own deliver the lion's share of rain throughout the course of a winter. So if we look back at last winter, sure, we had 50 of them. We had 22 that came to Central California, but we actually only had 2 last winter that made it into the Bay Area that fall into that highest category. either the 4 or the 5, and you kind of see the arrows right here making a connection. Those are the two that brought us the bulk of the rain throughout the course of the winter. They brought us some of the bigger concerns from a flooding standpoint when they came through, and they were the ones that we really needed to message before they got here. This is not a typical storm. This is an atmospheric river, and it's on the high end of the scale. It's category 4, 3 or 4 or 5, in that case by late winter, where we really need to be aware of them. So communicating the nuance of these is important, because every storm that comes in here, almost all of them have some component of an atmospheric river to them. We've just gotten much better at recognizing them. By the way, remember we used to just call this the Pineapple Express back in the 80s? That was before we started to scientifically analyze these things and understand how they work and what they look like. We've got a much broader overview of the importance of them. Pineapple Express is the term that was given to the storms where you could follow that plume of moisture all the way back to Hawaii, because it was picking up all that moisture from down near Hawaii and dragging it right towards California. So we called those a Pineapple Express back in the 80s before we recognized how widespread and how varying atmospheric rivers can be. They don't all come from Hawaii. Can't call every atmospheric river a Pineapple Express. Some of them streaming across the upper latitudes. Got nothing to do with pineapples or Hawaii. We needed a way to communicate these things, which is why the term atmospheric river was kind of canonized in the meteorological realm. And then we started to put them into categorizations as well, from 1 to 5. By the way, these things happen all across the globe. I mean, there's a couple that are going to happen in the Atlantic over the next couple of days. Do we call those a Pineapple Express? Probably shouldn't, not if we want to communicate clearly about how these things are working. So in light of the fact that these things are now getting publicized broadly, probably overdone, really, considering the nature of most of these storms not having the kind of impacts that the terms were really initially devised to communicate for us. This is a term that was put together by the Scripps Institute of Oceanography to give us a broader sense of awareness when the really significant storms were coming, so we knew to be prepared for a lot more rain than a typical storm. So many storms have atmospheric rivers. It's the clear communication of the higher intensity storms that's going to matter going forward.